latest noises coming out with JD Vance's speech at the event in Washington organized by the Munich Security Conference showed that there's some impatience with the intransigent Russian negotiating stance. But on the whole, this has been a lot of diplomatic sound and fury with no real results, and some very ominous signs of willingness in the United States to see Russia as basically a friend and the European Union as basically an enemy. And if that trajectory continues, then it's very bad, not just for Ukraine.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are joined by a writer and consultant specialising in European and transatlantic security, Edward Lucas. Edward is a senior fellow and senior advisor at the Centre for European Policy Analysis. He's worked in many capital cities, including Moscow, as a foreign correspondent and is a columnist for The Times. He's also the author of 5 books, including The New Cold War. Edward Lucas, welcome to Frontline. It's great to see you.
Hello, Kate.
So, Edward, Russia's Victory Day is the day when Putin pushes his own version of history about the Second World War, about the defeat of Nazi Germany. What is his version?
His version is what I call the Disneyfied version of World War II history, in which a blameless Soviet Union was attacked by a wicked Nazi Germany, and thanks to the tremendous heroism and bravery of the, and I underline this, Russian people, scored a tremendous victory over Nazi Germany, almost single-handed, in 1945, the result of which was to establish an entirely justified Soviet zone of influence in the countries that were liberated on the way to Germany. And this extraordinary story of heroism and achievement, for some reason, is not taken seriously by the rest of the world, which proves that they are probably Nazi sympathizers.
And we are speaking on the eve of the day that they celebrate with a parade in Moscow. What message do you think Putin will be pushing on the 80th anniversary?
Well, he'll be taking that kind of Soviet war myth and cult of victory and bringing it up to date in the present day, because one of the key messages of the Russian war in Ukraine is that just as our grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought the Nazis, we're fighting Nazism now, and they regularly refer to Volodymyr Zelensky, who, and I'm sure I don't need to tell frontline viewers and listeners this, is himself Jewish, but leave that aside, that he leads a neo-Nazi regime in Ukraine, and therefore they try and borrow all that sort of valor and moral weight of the fight against Hitler and apply it to the war in Ukraine now, and also try and denigrate any Western support for Ukraine as being akin to supporting Hitler back then.
And from your time living in Moscow, did you get a sense of how much the Russian public actually buys his version of events?
Well, of course, it's developed over time, and it is worth mentioning that this victory cult, with its many lacunae and distortions, is actually quite a recent thing. That in the Stalin era and the Khrushchev era and the early Brezhnev era, the so-called Great Patriotic War, which is what the Russians call the Second World War, was very much in the background. It was so traumatic and so recent that it wasn't really a big thing. And it was only in the mid to late Brezhnev years that all this razzmatazz on Red Square and flypasts and marches and the idea of the sort of great moral weight of the 1945 victory was became a sort of centerpiece. It used to be that the main Russian holiday was the revolution. It was commemorating the so-called Great October Revolution, which of course actually happened in November by our calendar. And but it's really only in recent years that the May Day or the May the 9th parade has become the sort of central feature of the calendar. And I think Russians regard this with a mix. It's a bit like in Britain. We're sort of very proud of it. We feel that this is, the time when our country stood tall and did great things. There's some, I think, when I was there, private reservations about the sort of way it was weaponized and made into a kind of thing for the Kremlin. And what Putin's done is to say that if you question me and my leadership and the war, then you are spitting on the graves of the heroes who fought the Nazis, and you're no better than one yourself. And I think that on the surface, people play along with that in Russia. Underneath, I think there is some skepticism.
So, how much embarrassment will the forced closure of Moscow airports be due to the persistent drone attacks in the days running up to the victory parade? How much embarrassment will it have caused?
Oh, it's deeply embarrassing for the Kremlin because A, this war was meant to be over in a few days, and of course, B, it's not really a war at all, it's a special military operation, and C, they're on the absolute verge of victory, and the Kiev regime is collapsing, and everything's actually going terribly well. And that whole sort of narrative of success and victory is just punctured by air raid sirens going off and airports being closed. And I think that the Ukrainians will probably, and we shall see what happens, but I think the Ukrainians will be probably doing their best to have at least something happening in Moscow on May the 9th in order to underline the fact that they're not only not beaten, but they're actually able to project military force deep inside Russia with embarrassing and destructive effect.
So, what message did it actually send to some of those 29 or so world leaders who were invited? And also Putin's friend forever, President Xi of China, who was arriving around the time that these attacks were taking place?
I think it will underline in their minds that Putin promised a victory that he couldn't deliver. And although many of these leaders loathe America and loathe the European Union and loathe the West and would be delighted to see these adversaries get a bloody nose in Ukraine, along with what they see as their proxy of the Zelensky-led authorities there. I think they're also bleakly realistic about Russia's weaknesses and its inability to bring this to a swift military conclusion. And of course, they'll be nervously wondering what happens if a Ukrainian drone gets through and actually hits the podium in Red Square, because then it'll be them. So I'm sure that the Moscow air defences will have been put on very high alert to make sure that doesn't happen. But even the fact that if they had to be used against a Ukrainian drone or missile, that in itself will be a very embarrassing.
The 80th anniversary of VE Day was the moment that the former US president, or to mark it, Joe Biden chose for his first post-presidential interview. And he was scathing about the Trump administration. He warned of how the shift in US-Europe relations would change the modern history of the world, of the risk of NATO dying, and said, we're facing the greatest threat to democracy now than at any time since the Second World War. How powerful do you think his comments are at this moment?
Well, they are quite powerful, but I sort of feel it would be a lot better if it wasn't coming from Joe Biden in a way, because his leadership and his presidency got us deeply into the mess that we're in now, and particularly his national security advisor Jake Sullivan, who I've been critical of in the past, but also he himself. They were so worried about escalation that they established a very dangerous principle in international relations, which is that nuclear blackmail works. And they didn't give Ukraine the weapons that they could have given them earlier on. They didn't give them uncaveated use of weapons. They didn't even allow allies to use their weapons freely. So our Storm Shadows, which should have been striking targets deep inside Russia, were only allowed to strike targets in the regions of Ukraine that are occupied by Russia, because the Americans wouldn't let us use the secret source, the geospatial navigation capabilities, which would be necessary for them to strike targets inside Russia. So I'm afraid the Biden administration's record is lamentable on this, and which is why actually many people in Ukraine and elsewhere rather hoped that it was going to be that Trump would win, on the grounds it was better to roll the dice and have a chance of change of policy than continue with disaster under Biden and then Harris.
So when you look at the Biden record, as you've just described it, and then you hear what he says about accusing Trump's dealings in terms of any peace negotiations as being amounting to appeasement of the Russian president, do you think that will fall on deaf ears, or will it have any impact on anyone in the White House who can influence Trump?
Well, my worry is that Trump is so allergic to Biden, and of course all the people who carry water for Trump as office holders in his administration will follow the lead from the top, that the reaction will probably be sharply in the other direction, and they will say, we are trying to make peace, you made this war happen. So I'm not sure that this is going to. I don't know who can really criticise Trump publicly and succeed, but it sure as hell isn't Joe Biden. It is a good message. I'm not decrying that, and I think that the Trump administration's treatment of Ukraine has been very regrettable, and as people have died because of it. The cut off of aid, particularly, although it was brief, was very damaging, and the uncertainty is damaging. It's not over yet, and I think the latest noises coming out with JD Vance's speech at the event in Washington, organised by the Munich Security Conference, showed that there's some impatience with the intransigent Russian negotiating stance. But on the whole, this has been a lot of diplomatic sound and fury with no real results, and some very ominous signs of willingness in the United States to see Russia as basically a friend and the European Union as basically an enemy. And if that trajectory continues, then it's very bad, not just for Ukraine.
The Kremlin will be desperate to disrupt what they may perceive as, I don't know if you agree with this, but as improving relations between Trump and Zelensky after that meeting at the Vatican and the subsequent minerals deal. They say it's necessary for Trump and Putin to meet. Necessary, so what? So that they can bring him back on side and try and influence him again?
I think that Trump's decision-making is heavily influenced by the last person he spoke to. And so if we get a Trump-Putin summit, probably he'll say, and Trump is vulnerable to flattery, and Putin as an intelligence officer knows how to prey on anybody's psychological weaknesses. And so you might well get another, as we've seen in the past, post-meeting press conference where Trump says some things that we all find extremely dangerous and unsettling. Whether that will lead to a fundamental change in US policy is another matter. But certainly I would deplore any Trump-Putin meeting, and I can see why the Russian side wants it.
So Putin's current best offer is a 3-day truce for Victory Day. It was described to Frontline by a former advisor to the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Yuri Sak, last week as putting the genocide to one side for a few days so as not to spoil the party. It's pretty clear, isn't it, from Putin's point of view, that there really is no appetite for compromise.
No, I don't think there is. I think at the moment Putin thinks the West is slowly splintering, or perhaps even rapidly splintering, that his economy is managing quite well under the circumstances, that the Ukrainians are on the back foot, and therefore there's no reason to stop. And unless we change that, he will continue, and he's got very maximalist goals of regime change in Kiev and a full incorporation of all the oblasts, not just the bits that he controls. And beyond that, he wants to change the European security architecture back to where it was in the mid-90s. I think he would be unlikely to get everything he wants in one bite, but even getting the first chunk of that will be very important if it demoralizes Europe, splits the Atlantic Alliance, and leaves a post-ceasefire Ukraine that's basically defenseless and demoralized. So my big worry in this is that we get what I've called Operation Second Helpings, where there is some sort of temporary pause to the fighting. A lot of the military readiness on our side goes down, and then Putin comes back in 6 months or a year or 18 months and has another go, probably on some sort of pretext where he can claim that the Ukrainians fired first, and then he'll finish the job, and we'll find it very difficult to cope with. But I think Putin would be prepared to take some sort of truce so long as there's no real security guarantees for Ukraine and no prospect of Ukraine being able to resist a further attack.
And in terms of leverage, what are the chances, do you think, of Senator Lindsey Graham's sanctions and tariffs bill being passed in the US? He wants to put bone crunching sanctions, it's been described as against Russia, and massive tariffs on the countries who are buying Russia's oil, petroleum products, natural gas, and uranium. What are the chances of that actually going through?
They're not zero. And I think that if Trump feels that he's been cheated by Putin, that Putin claimed he was interested in ceasefire and peace, and now is pursuing these maximalist goals, there is a chance that Trump will decide to teach Putin a lesson. But I don't think it's a very big chance. I think that there's fundamentally Trump's attention span's quite short, and we've seen with other international what one might call preoccupations. I wouldn't call them policies, but he plays with the idea of Panama, tosses that aside. Greenland, tosses that aside. Canada, that's boring, not going to do that anymore. There's the tariff war, well, that didn't work so well, so pause those. And so we see a very rapid cycle. And I think that to maintain a sustained program of economic sanctions on Russia, which become a really major priority of the administration, it pushes it hard enough to bring Russia to the negotiating table. I'm afraid I think the chance of that's quite low. We might get some sort of symbolic smacks on the wrist. What would, of course, it would be terrific if we could do it, would be to seize the Russian central bank assets. And that's something that I'm pushing for here in Britain, where we have 27 billion of assets in the bank here. The Europeans could do a lot on this, and I'm pushing on that too. And of course, the Americans who do it could do their bit, and the clock's ticking on that. So that rather than I think the sort of idea of magical secondary sanctions, I'd rather go for the thing that we can do absolutely straight away now, which would produce lots of money and really hurt Russia.
So, how are you getting on? You say you're pushing for that in Britain, and I mean, it's been talked about for quite some time, hasn't it? Are you confident that at some stage that this will actually be agreed, that those frozen Russian assets will be released?
I would love to be confident. It's astonishingly frustrating, and we had a amendment to the Ukraine assistance bill back in January, where we got friendly parliamentarians to push this in the House of, I think it was in the House of Lords as an amendment, and the government said no. And there's nervousness about the legal position, and there's nervousness about what it will do to the confidence in sterling and the euro. And my answer to that is, we'll find there are legal ways of doing this. And if your lawyers tell you you can't, then get different lawyers and find out a way that you can. And yes, there will be some damage to confidence in the sterling and euro as reserve currencies, but there's a lot of damage being done to the dollar as well recently. And so we're actually, oddly, Trump's made it a lot easier, I think, to say that we're going to seize the euro and sterling assets. And I hope the European foreign ministers are meeting in the Gymnich informal as we speak. I hope it may come up there. I'm hoping to get it discussed at finance ministers' meetings as they're coming up. There's a lot we can do, but in the end, it boils down to political will, and that, I'm afraid, is still lacking.
Do you think that financial pressure could actually bring Putin to the negotiating table?
I don't think on its own, but it would release a lot of money, which we can then use to do things that will apply a lot more pressure to Russia. It's worth remembering that the Ukrainian defense industry, which is extremely advanced technologically now and is able to do real damage to the Russians, is not working at full capacity because of shortage of money. And so we could, if we had that 300 billion or a chunk of it, we can immediately start paying the Ukrainians to make weapons for themselves and also to restock our own arsenals.
One of your specialities is transatlantic relations, and the former US ambassador to Ukraine, John Herbst, told Frontline a couple of weeks ago that there is a large number of Republicans in Congress who are uneasy about the direction of travel of the new administration on foreign policy and towards the war in Ukraine, and that a recent poll of the public found 61% of Americans think he's weak on Putin, with something like, as in Trump, and 69% thinking aid should continue to be given to Ukraine. Do you think there is a growing swell in the American public to actually be more vocal about Ukraine? Do you have some hope there?
I do have some hope, but I also notice that what my Republican friends tell me in private is very different from what they'll say in public. And I think so long as they are worried about having Elon Musk's millions deployed against them in primary campaigns before the midterms, they are going to be quite quiet. And the cowardice of the congressional Republicans seen from here is just prudent self-interest seen from there. I think that it's clear that the one thing Trump can't control is the markets. And if you have pressure on the stock market, pressure on the bond market, pressure on the currency markets, these send signals which he cannot just push away with posts on social media. And that financial pressure changes the political pressure, changes the political weather as well. And so we may see both pressure from the markets to change course, but also congressmen thinking, well, my voters are really unhappy about some of these foreign policy things and what they're doing, and I'm going to speak out a bit more boldly. But I think there's a great danger in our thinking about this, that we look for sort of magical solutions and we think someone's going to intervene. The congressional Republicans are going to tell Trump he can't do this anymore. The court's going to tell Trump he can't do this anymore. And then suddenly it's all going to be all right again. It's not. We have to get on with our job here in Europe. We have to spend a lot more money. We have to take a lot more risk. We have to accept a lot more inconvenience. And we have to accept that the old transatlantic alliance as we imagined it, and it was never quite what we imagined, but that's over. This is our job now, and we have to really just push on and not hope for magical solutions from across the Atlantic.
And Edward, you were based in Moscow from 1998 to 2002 when Putin first became president. How was he regarded in Russia at the time by the public and by foreign journalists like yourself? And with hindsight, is there anything which could have prevented the existential threat that he's posing to Europe today?
Well, the first answer to your question is that when he came in initially, he was not regarded as particularly impressive. He was this sort of small grey figure from the shadows, and he looked as though he would be. I think there would have been 4 prime ministers already that year when he was made prime minister, and quite likely there'd be more to come. And then when he did become president, he was seen as the sort of Yeltsin regime's placeholder who was there to stop them getting locked up. And there were lots of jokes. I'm afraid they're untranslatable and extremely rude, so I can't tell them on Times Radio. That various sort of jokes with complicated puns.
Tell me later.
So there was not and so he certainly grew into the job. But I think it's very important not to over-personalize this. One of my fundamental points, which I've been banging on about for years, is that our problems with Russia predate Putin. It was 1993 that the Yeltsin's advisor, Sergei Karaganov, came out with the so-called Karaganov Doctrine, which said that anyone who speaks Russian anywhere in the world is in a political category which deserves protection from the Russian state. And that was basically the same attitude that Hitler took to the Volksdeutsche, who was stranded outside Germany after the Versailles Treaty. And it was an extremely dangerous doctrine that Russia has. We in Britain, we would never say we have the right to intervene on behalf of English speakers in other countries. It's a sort of old-fashioned imperialist sort of ethno-nationalist approach. And all through the 90s, there were plenty of warning signs about the way Russia was going, and we chose to ignore them. We were warned by Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and others in terms, and we patronized and ignored and belittled those warnings. So I think that Putin is a symptom of something very deep-seated in Russia, which is the sort of basic idea of Russian imperialism, and we shouldn't over-personalize this. And when he's gone, the problems will remain.
And Edward, we are speaking finally on the 80th anniversary of VE Day, Victory in Europe. What lessons do you think we can draw that apply today when Europe is again facing a very existential threat?
Well, I think we should be honest about history. And I started this by outlining Putin's sort of war myth. And of course, there are very good rebuttals to that. Western help was absolutely vital for the Soviet Union to defeat the Nazis. They never say thank you. Hitler and Stalin were co-conspirators before they were enemies. Putin hates any talk of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Most of the fighting actually took place outside the territory of what's now Russia, and a disproportionate share of the casualties were actually non-Russians. the liberation of Eastern Europe was actually very rapidly followed by occupation and so on and so forth. So we should make all these points, but we should also be pretty clear about our own shortcomings and the complacency and naivety and greed of the 1930s, I'm afraid, are still marching over Britain and over other countries. We love celebrating VE Day. We're much less good at thinking honestly about how we got into the mess in the first place and how very narrowly we escaped the fate we deserved in the in 39, 40. It's not often recognised that most of the British Army didn't fire a shot between Dunkirk and D-Day because it was still busy being trained, because we were so militarily weak after the disarmament of the 20s and 30s. And I'm afraid we're making the same mistakes again in spades now that our armies are profoundly, Army, Navy and Air Force, are all profoundly hollowed out. And we've lost a lot of the sort of resilience that we need to cope with the sort of stress that a conflict of any kind would bring. So I will sing along with Vera Lynn, and tear will go in my eye as I see the Spitfires fly over and these other sort of things we do. But the bleak truths of the 1930s deserve very careful and study and a lot of humility when we look at them and our position now.
Edward Lucas, it's been great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Kate.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news or read it on thetimes.com.